I mean, the Sierra Club doesn't even want us growing corn.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Commstock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, I have the founder of Commstock Investments, Mr. David Kruse, with us. David, it's a pleasure to get to visit with you again. The topic for today, you wanted to cover some things that happen in agriculture that can add value beyond just the commodities, growing commodities and that sort of thing, and taking what they give you. There are ways where you can add to your bottom line, right?
We discussed that in a recent report, Commstock report on the 15th, adding to value. I kind of went through the history of it. The first thing farmers tried to do rather than sell grain and take a wagon to town was to walk it off the farm. And so almost every farm, 50, 75 years ago or whatever had livestock. I know on our farm at one time when I was a kid growing up, we had chickens and dairy and hogs and cattle, and got rid of the dairy about the time I graduated from high school. When I started farming in 73, it was a kind of a known thing that you'd be feeding some livestock. And hogs was probably our primary livestock, but we fed cattle too. And as time went on, that's the way we made our money. The first money that I made to get started in agriculture was I had 400 head of hogs that I'd bought. We farrowed a few of them and had added to those with some feeder pigs. And I sold those 400 head of hogs and actually made enough money off them, about $30 a head. And that's what a 1972 Case IH 1066 cost. Paid for it with those 400 hogs. I don't know how much of a tractor 400 hogs would pay for today, but I'm pretty sure it'd be a lot less. You wouldn't even get a garden tractor hardly for that. So, in some cases, so things have changed as time went on. We continued with livestock. Eventually, when the transition came, that you either had to integrate and then become much larger scale up, we went just cattle and kind of dropped the hogs. There was a debate. Public debate at the time when this move toward concentration integration began. As I said initially, almost all farms had at least some livestock, usually more than one time. We began specializing, and the livestock operations got a lot bigger, and they became called CAFOs. And so there was a huge uproar over the regulation and such with those, and that transition that had to be made. I had part of the Commstock report contributed into that debate or conversation. Primarily, I guess what concerned me was the concentration on the packing side. When I produced hogs, I had probably half a dozen different ways that, people I could call up and get a bid on a hog every day. And that's pretty much gone the wayside now. There are very few hogs that are traded in a negotiated market. Most all are now in part of integrated operations. And in fact, a lot of the hog industry is selling pig slots where they don't own the hogs anymore. I guess that was part of the reason that I made that transition away from hogs at that time. The cattle industry today is also moved toward concentration, of course, on the packer side, but it hasn't been quite the same way of actually the packers owning the hogs. A significant amount of cattle that are traded in a negotiated manner, although that has been shifting more to formulas and contracts along those ways. And so it's either here to there, but I still consider the cattle industry to be an independent producer type industry, where on the hog side, not so much anymore. Most of the hogs seem to be owned either by the large integrators or the packers, and that way. But the bottom line to all this is that what we were looking at is the need to support the demand side. So grain producers had a market to sell into that could be profitable. Well, in those days, I mentioned, you could do that just with cattle and hogs. And as time went on, that became less so. We needed other forms of value added to our grain, and exports became playing an important role in that. We, I guess, considered ourselves at one point in time to be feeding the world. And in doing so, we added, I guess, a second leg underneath the stool of demand that was supporting our corn prices. It was not as reliable, however, from the standpoint, Nixon had an embargo on soybeans, Jimmy Carter had an embargo on wheat, and it was an up and down thing. Now we've gotten into trade wars and tariffs and everything else. And so, it's a very much a moving target and not as reliable. So we got in it past 2000, and we were actually not doing well, were we? We were basically relying on the government, farm subsidies, to keep us going, and didn't want that to be the third leg underneath our stool. Was always to have to be dependent on farm subsidies. And so I joined a number of advocates for developing an ethanol industry and heavily promoted that at the time. Looking back in history, it represents 5.5 billion bushels of corn demand, which is a significant number. Our feeding, I think we're about 5.9, and our exports are 2.67. Actually, the ethanol is now about twice exports. So it's become more and more important. But it put that third leg underneath the stool of demand that we needed in each stage that we went through as far as adding demand. Well, this next year, USDA, I think, if I look at the number here that I have, says we're going to produce 15.82 billion bushels of corn, and we're going to consume 15.46. And so on their current estimate or forecast, we're going to overproduce by 360 million bushel. That's going to take the current carryover the way they had it to 1.8 billion. I'm fearing that the way the spring is going with extremely early planting, maybe a little less prevent plant, easy could end up with another million acres of corn. And so that could come closer to a 500 million bushels increase over what we consume. And so here again, and we don't have what we consider to be really profitable corn today. And so we're struggling to try to find another value-added component that would help us consume that much corn.
So when you talk about value added from that particular angle, that leads us to the discussion about things like the SAF regulations. And you also hear about the 45Z proposals in Congress. Don't seem to really get any traction on that these days. David, do you have any news on that?
Well, let's back up a little bit on that. And first of all, we have President Trump in office again. If you go back to his first term, he approved 1.5 billion gallons worth of RIN waivers, renewable identification numbers. Basically, when they get assigned to, or they get a request from a refinery not to refine ethanol, that has to be, they're obligated under the RFS to do so. And so they filed for a waiver from the RFS, essentially. Well, they approved 1.5 billion of them in his first term, which that equates back to over 500 million bushels of lost corn demand by doing that. During the Biden administration, there was a lot of requests for waivers, none were approved. Well, I believe last week the new EP administrator said that they still have all these waivers pending, and they were going to review them. It's concerning to me. Well, his first term, they thought they offset some things with the temporary rear-round thing. What I mean by temporary is only a few states for a few months have the waiver from the EPA to market that product. They have expanded that waiver to nationwide each year. When it comes up, they seem to get it done. But it handicaps retailers and such because they can't depend on it. In other words, do you really want to go out and spend money to dedicate a fuel pump to selling even if you can sell it part of the year, time of the year? And so it's really restricted its expansion and use from a nationwide standpoint. Right now, our standard fuel is E10. That would give us potential for as much as 5% more. Each 1% increase in ethanol fuel consumption relative to that percentage is about 400 million bushels of corn. And we keep getting really close to getting nationwide permanent, and then it seems to disappear. For example, there was a recent Republican bill that they come out with the first draft, and permanent E15 was in there. Second draft comes out, permanent E15 was in there. And then it gets to the final draft, which became the law. It's mysteriously disappeared. We don't get anywhere, and it's getting a little tiresome from our perspective because that's the low-hanging fruit that we could go after. Well, now it gets a lot more complicated with the credits and the Z for carbon credits. I guess I'm going to be a little pessimistic on what we get from that from the Congress. It seems as though that we go out there, and I have been out to Washington, and I have talked to some of the congressmen. And they're all good to go. They understand 5Z and how important it is to agriculture and to carbon credits and to ethanol, but it doesn't make the bills. is not a hill they die on, and they'll get it in the first draft like they've done some other things. And I believe that some of it was in this first draft of the budget bill, but there are also some people promising it won't be there in the end. So I guess we'll see. But it's a struggle at this point in time to get the background to what we need. I am a strong proponent of CO2 carbon pipelines. First of all, I have an anhydrous pipeline that goes through one of our farms. I don't know, last winter I got a phone call from them, and what they do for their safety procedures is they run what they call a PIG, some electronic device or whatever, through the pipeline. It analyzes if there's any weaknesses in the pipeline, and then of course then if they find something, then they go and they repair it. And so this spring that happened. They came out and dug up whatever section they've got identified and repaired it. We've not had any issue with that pipeline. We had to tile inside the interior of the one side of the pipeline and bring the tile drainage underneath it. That wasn't a big deal. That easement for that went clear back beyond me before my previous ownership of the farm, so on that side of it. So now they of course, now there's concern. They're the same type of a thing over the safety. I believe that that's a lot less of a threat than anhydrous pipelines. It is still considered to be hazardous material in that way. There was one instance in Louisiana that really wasn't apples and apples where there was an issue, but I guess I believe that they'll take care of the safety part of it. And so we did do easements through our farms. The reason for it is that you mentioned SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. There is a huge market for that ahead. And it's be able to qualify as a feedstock to produce SAF, you have to have a low carbon rating to your feedstock. Current ethanol has this carbon scoring has dropped considerably from where it was, but it's not quite yet to the level that qualifies for SAF. So we have a couple of SAF production companies in the United States, and they're getting their ethanol from Brazil. I guess Brazil uses eucalyptus to fuel its plants, and therefore it comes up with a kind of grandfathered with a low carbon score. And so how do we compete with that? Do we want to import Brazilian ethanol for SAF? It seems to make no sense. We're looking for this next value-added venture, and the Summit carbon pipeline has 57, I believe it is, ethanol plants that have signed on. And the background story to that is that if it becomes reality, these plants have a pledge to expand their production by 25 to 100%. There is a huge future boost in ethanol demand. We all know what happens as a result of that. We've seen it happen with the ethanol industry where our basis levels improve. All farmers benefit from that. It's enough demand that we're going to overproduce by at least 360 million bushels this year, maybe more. We will therefore get demand to handle that. And so as we go forward, this controversy is unfolding today. State laws, governor looking at whether or not to veto an Iowa new legislative bill. It's really up in the air. It's going to sort out pretty quickly here. But it's something, in my opinion, that we really need as that next value-added project to basically give us enough to support our corn prices.
So, David, what do you think the root of all this resistance is? It just seems like no matter how much effort everybody puts into it, it's like it's just going into a black hole somewhere, and somewhere everything keeps getting shot down.
Well, it's interesting. Is that really the truth? Or, I mean, these ethanol companies have 75% of their easements. That means it's 25% of the people that are still balking. Are they balking for a higher easement value, or are they really under no circumstances? Many of them is under no circumstances do they want this. The Sierra Club has sold them a bill of goods as far as the safety issues and such, and the issue of eminent domain comes up into it. Well, under all the previous regulations, if you got to 75% for voluntary easements, your utilities boards approved projects. They're changing the rules here in this situation, and that's really going to have an impact on future projects. So far Summit has exceeded all what it previously took to get approval for such a construction project. And they also have the approval, but it's being blocked by South Dakota primarily. I'm going to assume this Iowa bill will get vetoed. Time will tell. So if you were another company looking at another project coming into Iowa, and you look and, hey, I can meet all the current regulations, but then you're going to look at each other and say, well, just look what they did to Summit. They went in there and they did that, and then everybody's changing the rules. Do we want to go anywhere near Iowa? I wouldn't. If I was one of those people, I wouldn't trust Iowa. And that's going to hurt us down the road for all kinds of economic activity, because we changed the rules in the middle of the game.
Well, it seems like one of the main concerns is safety, and another concern is environmental. That's what keeps getting brought up all the time. But I mean, think about it, David. How many millions of miles of pipeline do we have in the country? And yet very few accidents, as opposed to maybe transport trucks on the highway or rail cars rolling over on the rails. I mean, it seems like there is a lot higher chance of a danger factor in transporting it above ground than what you ever have on the pipelines. And then, of course, when it comes to the environmental aspect of it, that kind of goes hand in hand with that, right?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it does. I believe that the environmental and the safety issues have been basically embellished and exaggerated by the opposition. They have to have something to come back with. The eminent domain is part of it. Once you get to, again, I said to 70%, the previous projects have been approved and they've gone forward. I think that's a good benchmark. You're never going to get everybody. That's what the eminent domain law was made for. Now, some will argue it should be up to 90%. Well, whatever, it gets tough. The overall situation with this eminent domain is there's some people just don't want anything on their farms. And I'm looking this to myself. I was paid well for my easement, commensurate to everything. I've had a previous experience with pipelines. Pretty soon, you'll be farming over it and not even know it's there. Just as I am in the current case. And what I'm trying to put out is the benefit for the general public. And by the general public, I mean all farmers. The ethanol plants are going to pay more for corn, and you'll increase your consumption. And as we've saw with the ethanol industry, nothing has contributed more wealth to the rural economy than the ethanol industry. And okay, are we going to stall now and stop here when we have another opportunity right in front of us that we can now become a feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel, and we're gonna basically throw away everything we've ever done in the past as far as how these decisions are made, and due to some activists or whatever. I mean, the Sierra Club doesn't even want us growing corn. To get right down to it, they're using these people. Is what they're doing in this opposition.
Well, think of any other case where a supermajority cannot decide what to do on an issue. I mean, whether it's business or government.
We can change the Constitution with 75% of the states in favor. That's been historically considered to be a supermajority that wins. And so when you meet the existing rules and then they come through and try to change the rules, who wants to do business with people like that? It isn't going to happen in the future. It's going to, and time will tell. We'll see what happens here. Summit has some other options, around South Dakota. But actually, one of those options may be that they ended up depositing the CO2 in Wyoming through Nebraska. And the irony of that is corn's going to be a whole lot more worth something in Nebraska than in South Dakota, where they didn't hook onto the lines because those ethanol plants won't be contributing. So that means the South Dakota farmers are going to try to sell their corn in Nebraska, when they could have their own market. Doesn't make sense.
Well, we're going to keep tabs on developments on the 45Z as it makes its way through Congress and bounces back and forth here and there, and as we go through on the calendar. If anything does develop, we'll keep you posted right here on the Commstock channel because it will apply to a lot of farmers in the Midwest. David, thanks for the comments today. Appreciate that. Very insightful, and look forward to talking with you again. David Kruse, founder of Commstock Investments, and that'll do it for this episode. Thanks again for tuning in. For producer Brianne Jenkins, I'm Marlin Bohling. We'll catch you next time right here on the Commstock channel. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.